Hello and welcome to Graywood Gardening. This past year I conducted an experiment with my pepper plants, my bell pepper plants, to see whether what kind of pot I started the seedlings in made any difference at the end of the year. So what I did is I tested 3.5-inch plastic pots versus this 6L 2-inch pots, paper pots, toilet paper tubes, and peat pots to see if I would get a better plant in one of them, a stronger plant, and at the end of the day, if I was going to get more peppers or better peppers. So this is everything that I learned from the pepper pot experiment this year. So normally I like to grow bell peppers in a 3.5-inch pot. This is 3.5 inch by 3.5 inch by 3.5 inch. I know that this grows a good bell pepper. It works great, but I would like to challenge the winning pot here with a standard 6-pack tray. Now this is actually almost exactly as deep as the 3.5-inch pot. It's just that it's only like a 2-inch cell size. So if I can grow bell peppers just as well in this little 6-pack, I can fit a lot more plants per tray. So if this works, that would be a big win. But both of these have the big drawback is that they're plastic, right? And I can use a pot like this many times. One like this is a little flimsier. It'll last for several years, but it's eventually going to rip. But at some point, both of these are going to end up in a landfill somewhere. So the most obvious alternative is the peat pot. So peat pot, in theory, is completely biodegradable. And the concept is you'll plant the peat pot, you'll start your seed in the peat pot, and you'll just plant the entire peat pot in the ground, and the peat pot itself will decompose away into the ground as the plant's roots spread. I will say I have used peat pots once before and wasn't a huge fan of them. And the main reason is I planted the peat pot in the ground and nothing decomposed. At the end of the year, the entire peat pot was there. Going up against the peat pot is going to be the toilet paper tube. I love the concept of this, which is you just pack this with dirt, plant your seed in here, and you actually get a little bit more height, a little bit more root growth area than you do in these others. Like the peat pot, this is biodegradable, so you can leave it in the ground, but unlike the peat pot, it's got a big opening at the bottom. It's got a big opening at the bottom. So when you plant this whole thing in the ground, again, without disturbing any roots or anything, it's got this hole that all the roots can grow down and spread out from. So only downside is I've used toilet paper tubes before, and that was the worst seed starting experience I have ever had. Lost everything that was started in toilet paper tubes. But those toilet paper tubes that we had when I did that experiment years and years ago were white. And I didn't think about it at the time, but afterwards I was like, oh, what if those were bleached? What if I planted my seeds in a bleached tube that I then repeatedly soaked with water and leached the bleach out? So I'm going to try it again. The final thing I'm going to try, in addition to these four, and one I'm most excited about, is a paper pot. And a paper pot is literally just a little pot you make yourself out of newspaper. It is very similar in size to the 3.5-inch pot. It is guarantee you that this is going to biodegrade when you plant it. Just like the peat pot and the toilet paper tube, the idea is you shove the whole thing in the ground. But yeah, this is newspaper, it's newsprint, it is going to disintegrate so fast. So I'm super excited to see how this one works out. Now, for the paper pot, I thought I would show you how I am making this. So they make special tools for making paper pots, but that's not really necessary. What you do need is a newspaper, and these things can be hard to come by these days. Take your newspaper, I cut it in half. If it's a double spread like this, this is going to be our paper pot. First thing I do is I fold it in half the long way. Basically what you're doing here is you're determining how tall your pot's going to be. I like fold it in half the long way. This feels like a good height to me. Then, this is my favorite part, you need to get yourself an empty wine bottle. Specifically a wine bottle that has like a good indent in the bottom. Almost all of them do. But if there's one with a flat bottom, that's not going to work. You need like the big indent. And this is how big around your pot's going to be. So all we're going to do is we're going to set the wine bottle on the paper, leaving some of the newspaper sticking out the bottom, enough that it will go, when you fold it up, it'll be a little bit more than halfway up. So then I'm going to use this as my template, and I'm just going to roll this up. Once you get it rolled up, starting where the seam is, you're going to fold this down and up into the wine bottle base, like so. Then pull this off. Technically at this point you have a pot. I do think it's a little flimsy here on top where the seam is, so I like to fold that over, and then I just do like a little fold over all around the top so that it looks consistent. The idea behind the paper pots, as I understand it, is this is actually quite stable, right? And it's not falling apart. But once you put dirt in, and you will pack the dirt down and you'll flatten the bottom, and that will make them much, much more stable. So I am super excited to see what things are going to look like growing in these. All right, let's get started. It's very important for the toilet paper tubes that you pack the soil down very, very firmly. If you're not packed down really well, when you lift these up, the soil will just pop right out the bottom. So it's actually that compaction that holds everything in place nicely. By the way, the two varieties that I'm doing here is X3R Red Knight F1 hybrid from Johnny Seed versus Ace F1, also from Johnny Seeds, also an F1. So we are testing a lot of different varieties of stuff we're growing now that we're gardening someplace where we don't plan on moving anytime soon or ever. We're trying to find the varieties that are going to grow best for us in our conditions. So, one last drink of water, and then we will get these guys onto the heat mats. Alright, so we will follow this experiment over the next few months and even after things get planted in the garden to see how they grow and how much fruit we get off of them. But I do have more seeds starting to do, and it's still cold outside, so it is a perfect time to start filling up these grow benches. So this is all of the bell peppers for our pot trial. It's everything in this tray, and then all the 3.5-inch pots right here on the end of this one. As you can see, we had really good germination across the board, and our seedlings are starting to get their first set of true leaves, which means it's time to thin them to just one per pot. One thing that is immediately apparent that it's a problem already is the toilet paper tubes. This is also the only place I have 2 toilet paper tubes that did not have anything germinate. And as I watered them, almost immediately, as the water soaked into the toilet paper tube, it expanded and it split apart on the seams here, and they started unraveling. This has also made it incredibly difficult to water them, because of course the water wants to just run off. And I think because the soil on the side is exposed, they dry out much, much faster than you think they would. And that probably is contributing to why a couple of these didn't germinate. I think I can already say that I, personally, would not use toilet paper tubes in the future. I can't imagine trying to wrestle with a whole tray of these things. I am not going to throw out anything that's growing, but I don't think I'm going to try to save these ones where nothing germinated. And I'm pretty convinced at this point that nothing in the toilet paper tubes is actually going to survive to planting time, but we'll find out. So let's take a look at how our bell pepper pot test is going. As you can see, peppers are all growing strong. All of these pots are growing healthy peppers. I have noticed a couple of things worth mentioning. First of which is on some of the paper pots, we're actually starting to see roots growing through the bottom of the paper, which is encouraging. That's exactly what we want to see. But I'm actually seeing the exact same thing, in some cases in much more roots coming out of some of the peat pots, which has not been my experience with peat pots in the past. So this is fantastic. One other thing I have noticed is both the paper pots and peat pots are occasionally getting some kind of little mushrooms growing out of them. And peppers really like it pretty dry. So I water these guys probably only once every 4, sometimes 5 days. I'm often not watering them until they start to droop. So this is definitely not getting excessive water. It seems to be something specific about the peat pots and the paper pots where the peat and the paper hold that moisture, which lets the fungus grow. But it doesn't seem to be hurting the plants in any way. So far it does not bother me. The toilet paper tubes, surprisingly, are holding together. In the very first week, in fact the first day when I started watering them, when the toilet paper tube got wet, some of them just broke apart, just split apart at the seams. And the ones that remain appear to be continuing to hold together. And on top of that, we also have roots growing out of the bottom of the toilet paper tube, which is kind of exciting. Now, one thing that is worth pointing out is there definitely seems to be a correlation between the size of the pot, specifically the diameter of the pot, and how big the plants are right now. For example, here in this 6-pack, which is like 2-inch diameter pot, we compare that to even one of the smaller 3.5-inch pot plants, we're getting a much bigger plant in this 3.5-inch pot than we are out of this little 2-inch. And in fact, even the paper pot plants are distinctly smaller than the ones that are growing in these big 3.5-inch. And without question, the toilet paper tube is making the smallest plant of all. So I don't know if any of this is really going to matter at the end of the day when things get planted outside. And then they have a chance to start growing and take off. So it'll be very interesting to see where we end up with this experiment. But certainly at this stage, there appears to be an argument to be made in favor of the larger 3.5-inch, 4-inch pots. But again, it's very possible that these ones that are smaller aren't that much smaller. It's entirely possible that once we plant them outside, they'll catch up and everything will be indistinguishable from each other. I'm going to be using this in-ground bed that I dug out that will be an asparagus bed next year to plant all of the peppers from our pepper pot experiment. And I've got some tags with me, so I'm going to make very certain to mark which ones are the peat pots, which ones are the paper pots, etc. And as a reminder, my rule for both the peat pots and the paper pots is I'm not going to try to take the plant out of the pot at all. I'm just going to plant the entire pot in the ground because that's how it's supposed to work, and it should just break down and the roots should root out through the pot. Well, now that we are in the peak pepper production season, I thought it would be a good time to check in on our pepper pot experiment. For the most part, it doesn't seem to matter what the pot was, even though the plants that were in the paper pots or the peat pots were a little bit smaller when I planted them out. They caught right up to the giant plastic pots and the 6-cell pots, and everything is around the same size with around the same production, with one exception, and that exception is the plants here that were in the toilet paper tubes, which a few of them died, so I only got 3 of these guys planted out. These plants have remained much smaller. They're still producing a lot of peppers, but the peppers they're producing are also a little bit smaller. Alright, I am now harvesting peppers from the peppers that are part of my pepper pot experiment. And so that's slowing things down a lot, partially because I planted them further apart, so they're big plants that are just loaded down, but partially because I'm having to stop after every 3 plants and record how many peppers I got, so I can use that toward the totals at the end. I am just finished with all of the peat pot ones, and I'm working on the paper pot ones. Now with all of the pepper plants killed off by the frost, it's the perfect time for the final check-in on the pepper pot experiment, which is to dig up a couple of these and see what actually happened to the pot. Because we have 3 types of pots that are actually in the ground. There's peat pots, paper pots, and the toilet paper tubes. And I'm curious to see how much of those pots actually remain at the end of the gardening season. Alright, this is one of the peppers that was planted in a peat pot, and there is literally no trace of... oh, here we go. This tiny little piece of peat pot is all I can find left of the pot. It looks like this peat pot basically entirely broke down over the course of the season, and there's certainly nothing constraining the roots of this plant. Let's double check one more just to be sure. Okay, this one you can see a little bit more. I think because this was planted, maybe not quite as deep. You can see the rim of the pot right here. So that's exactly what you want to see. Peat pots did a fantastic job. It looked like any part of it that was under the ground completely disintegrated. So now, let's see how the paper pots did. So 1, 2, 3 maybe. This is a paper pot one here. So I'm seeing the exact same situation here, if anything even more so. There is no trace of the newspaper that actually was the pot for this plant. So that has completely disintegrated as well. Again, fantastic result. What I'm most curious about is over here we have the toilet paper tube ones, and these guys were much smaller when I planted them. Also didn't get nearly as much fruit off of these, and the peppers we did get off of them were smaller in general. So let's take a look at how the toilet paper tube looks after a full season. Okay, yeah, it looks like the toilet paper tube has also broken down entirely. And again, nothing stopping this root growth. So yeah, in terms of the pots that are meant to go in the ground and break down, all of them did just fine. The peat pots were basically completely disintegrated, paper pots disintegrated, and the toilet paper tubes, oh, there's like a little piece of a toilet paper tube there, also completely disintegrated. We just didn't see quite as good growth from the toilet paper tube plants. Alright, and so what was the final conclusion of the Great Pepper Pot experiment? Well, the short version is, basically every pot did just as well. The plants were different sizes when I planted them out, they all caught up, they all produced the same amount of peppers of the same size that were just as tasty, with the one exception of the toilet paper tube. I really struggled to grow the seedlings in the toilet paper tube. I actually had several of them die. When I planted the plants out, they were much smaller than anything else, and they stayed smaller throughout most of the growing season. They were just starting to catch up in like mid-September. Most of the plants produced 6 or 7 peppers per plant. The ones with the toilet paper tubes produced 4 or 5 peppers per plant, so it might just be a coincidence that it was 1 or 2 less, but all the peppers they produced were much smaller, like half the size of the peppers in all the rest of these pots. So for me anyway, I am ready to write off toilet paper tubes and not use these for seed starting again. Every other pot performed basically just as well. There's no meaningful difference. The couple interesting things I think about that is, number one, the 3.5-inch pots, which are much larger, didn't actually provide a lasting advantage from having a bigger seedling than the 6L 2-inch pot did. I think it's also noticeable that the peat pots and the paper pots also didn't give an advantage, where it's supposed to be better for the plants because you don't have to remove them from the pot and disturb their roots, so you're supposed to have less transplant shock. I didn't see any advantage at all from this. So the end of the day, with the possible exception of toilet paper tubes, you should be able to use whatever pot makes sense for you. I think this is a little exciting because if space is a concern, which for almost everyone it is, you can use one of these smaller 6Ls, and you get a lot more plants in the same square footage as these bigger pots, and they grow just as fine. To me, this definitely means the peat pot is out. This is the most expensive option here because it's one use, it's not cheap. But I'm very excited about using more of the paper pots. I'm trying eventually to eliminate all plastic from my gardening if I can. I'm certainly going to keep reusing the plastic pots that I have for as long as they hold up, but I actually don't have enough plastic pots for all of the plants I want to start next year. And so this is great news to me. I don't need to buy more plastic pots. I can just buy a newspaper and make dozens and dozens of pots out of that. Alright, so that is what I have learned from this one small experiment. Please leave a comment below, tell me what you thought, tell me what I'm missing, what I did wrong or should have done differently. And if you have any questions, you can leave it in a comment, or you can email me at brian@graywoodgardening.com. Alright, happy gardening.